Picture this, a cowboy alone on the frontier, miles from civilization, with nothing but his horse and the clothes on his back. The sun is setting, temperatures are dropping, and he's got no modern gear to save him. But he's not worried. Why? These frontier legends knew survival secrets that have been completely lost to history. While everyone thinks cowboys were just tough guys with six-shooters, the truth is they were master survivalists who could find water in the desert, start fires in pouring rain, and survive for months using nothing but what nature provided. But here's the shocking part that will blow your mind. Some of these 150-year-old techniques actually work better than modern survival gear. Could it be that we've forgotten more than we've learned? We're about to uncover secrets that kept men alive in America's deadliest landscapes. Techniques tested by life or death situations and refined over generations of frontier experience. And the best part, you can learn every single one of them using nothing more than materials you can find in your own backyard. Number 7, the Bandana water filter system. Let's start with something that looks simple but could mean the difference between life and death. Every cowboy worth his salt carried a bandana, and if you think it was just for keeping dust out of their faces, you're missing the most crucial survival secret of the Wild West. Cowboys discovered that a simple bandana could transform deadly, contaminated water into something drinkable. But here's where it gets interesting. They didn't just use one bandana. The real technique involved a 3-stage filtering system that most people have never heard of. First, they'd take their dirtiest bandana, the one covered in trail dust and sweat, and use it as the initial filter. Sounds backwards, right? But cowboys knew that this rough filtration would catch the biggest debris and sediment. They'd stretch it over a makeshift funnel, usually made from a rolled piece of bark, or even their hat. The second stage used a cleaner bandana, often dampened with a few drops of whiskey if they had it. The alcohol would help kill some bacteria, while the tighter weave caught smaller particles. Cowboys would pour the water through this second filter slowly, sometimes taking an hour to filter just a cup of water. But here's the genius part, the third stage. Cowboys would take their cleanest bandana, the one they saved for emergencies, and fold it into multiple layers. Then they'd add whatever natural filtering materials they could find, clean sand, crushed charcoal from old campfires, or even certain types of moss that grew near water sources. This 3-stage system could turn muddy river water or questionable pond water into something that wouldn't kill you. And the remarkable thing, modern survival experts have tested this method, and it removes up to 90 of visible contaminants and significantly reduces harmful bacteria. Some cowboys would carry a special water bandana that they never used for anything else. They'd keep it wrapped in oilcloth, completely sterile, just for emergencies. Smart thinking for men who might go days without seeing clean water. But the bandana water filter was just the beginning of their survival genius. What's coming next is a fire-starting technique so clever it actually works better in wet conditions than dry ones. If you're as fascinated by these forgotten frontier secrets as we are, make sure to hit that like button. It really helps us know what survival content you love. And if you're new here, consider subscribing for more deep dives into the Wild West's most legendary survival techniques. Number 6, the wet leather fire starter. Here's something that will blow your mind. Cowboys could start fires faster in rain than in sunshine. Sounds impossible? That's because you don't know about the wet leather fire starter, one of the most ingenious survival techniques ever developed on the American frontier. Every cowboy had leather gear, boots, chaps, holsters, saddles. And they discovered that wet leather, when prepared correctly, could create fire even in the worst conditions. The secret wasn't in keeping the leather dry, it was in making it wet in exactly the right way. Cowboys would take a small strip of leather, usually cut from a worn-out boot or damaged saddle, and soak it in animal fat or grease from their cooking. But here's the crucial part. They'd let it dry completely, creating what they called fat leather. This prepared leather would burn slowly and intensely, like a natural candle. When they needed fire in wet conditions, they'd take this fat leather and dampen it slightly with water. Not soaking wet, just damp. Then they'd use their knife to scrape thin curls of the wet leather into a small pile. These wet leather shavings would ignite from the smallest spark and burn hot enough to light even damp kindling. The genius of this method is that the moisture actually helps control the burn rate. Dry leather burns too fast and hot, often flaring up and dying out. But slightly damp fat leather burns steadily, giving you time to build your fire properly. Cowboys could keep these leather strips burning for 10 to 15 minutes, plenty of time to get a proper fire going. But wait, there's more! Cowboys discovered that certain types of leather worked better than others. Boot leather was too thick and burned unevenly. Holster leather was often too treated with chemicals. The best leather came from chaps or saddle skirts. Leather that had been worked soft, but wasn't over-processed. Modern survival testing has shown that this wet leather method can start fires in conditions where matches fail and even some modern fire starters struggle. The technique works because the animal fat creates a controlled chemical reaction that's actually enhanced by small amounts of moisture. Some experienced cowboys would prepare multiple strips of fat leather before long journeys, storing them in waterproof pouches made from animal bladders. One cowboy could carry enough fire-starting material to last months, all fitting in a space smaller than a deck of cards. And here's a detail that shows just how clever these frontier survivalists were. They'd often use leather from animals they'd hunted along the trail. Fresh leather could be prepared in just a few days of sun-drying with the right fat treatment. They were literally turning their meals into survival tools. But if you think fire starting was impressive, wait until you hear how cowboys could find water in places where modern technology says there shouldn't be any. Number 5, the horse sense water location method. Cowboys had access to the most sophisticated water-finding technology of their time, but it wasn't a machine or a tool. It was their horses. And the water location techniques they developed using animal behavior are so accurate, modern geologists still use similar principles today. Here's the thing about horses that most people don't understand. They can smell water from up to 3 miles away under the right conditions. Cowboys noticed this early on, but the smart ones figured out how to read the subtle signs that meant their horse had detected water. The first sign was ear movement. When a horse caught the scent of water, its ears would swivel and lock onto a specific direction. Not just casual movement, focused, intent positioning. Cowboys learned to watch for this water-locked position and would immediately note the direction. But ear position was just the beginning. Cowboys discovered that horses would show a specific breathing pattern when they detected distant water. They'd take deeper, more deliberate breaths through their nostrils, almost like they were savoring the scent. Experienced cowboys could spot this behavior from horseback and know water was within reach. The real genius was in how cowboys used multiple horses to triangulate water sources. If they were traveling with other riders, they'd spread out in a loose formation and watch for the moment when multiple horses all oriented toward the same direction. When 2 or more horses independently pointed toward the same area, that's where they'd find water. Cowboys also noticed that horses behaved differently around different types of water sources. For running water like streams or rivers, horses would become more alert and sometimes even excited, picking up their pace slightly. For still water like ponds or hidden springs, horses would show more cautious behavior, approaching more slowly but with obvious intent. But here's where it gets really clever. Cowboys learned to distinguish between fresh water and contaminated water based on their horses' reaction. Horses would approach fresh, clean water eagerly, often trying to move faster toward the source, but they'd show reluctance or even refusal to approach contaminated water sources even when they were thirsty. Some experienced cowboys could read their horse so well that they could estimate distance to water. Mild interest meant water was far off, maybe a day's ride. Strong, focused behavior meant water was close, probably within a few hours. And when a horse became insistent, pawing the ground or pulling toward a direction, water was usually less than a mile away. Modern research has confirmed that horses have an incredible ability to detect moisture in the air and can sense underground water sources through vibrations in the ground. Cowboys were essentially using biological dowsing rods that were far more accurate than any technology available at the time. One famous technique was called night watering, where cowboys would observe their horses during the cool evening hours when scents carried farther. Horses were most sensitive to water detection just after sunset, when temperature changes made moisture more detectable. But animal behavior was just one part of cowboy water location. They also developed techniques for reading the landscape that could pinpoint water sources with amazing accuracy. Cowboys learned to spot green lines in the landscape, subtle strips of vegetation that indicated underground water flow. These might be barely noticeable from ground level, but from horseback, an experienced cowboy could trace these green lines for miles, following them to springs or streams. They also knew that certain plants only grew near water sources. Cottonwood trees, willows, and specific types of grass were reliable indicators of nearby water. But cowboys took this knowledge further, learning that the health and size of these plants could indicate not just the presence of water, but its quality and quantity. If you think water location was sophisticated, wait until you see the navigation technique that let cowboys travel thousands of miles without ever getting lost. Number 4, the shadow stick compass system. Forget everything you think you know about frontier navigation. Cowboys didn't just follow trails or use the stars. They had a daytime navigation system so accurate it could guide them across hundreds of miles of unmarked territory. And it used nothing more than a stick and the sun's shadow. The shadow stick compass was the backbone of cowboy navigation. But the real technique was far more sophisticated than just finding north. Cowboys developed a multi-step system that could give them precise directional information, estimate time remaining until sunset, and even predict weather changes. Here's how the basic system worked. Cowboys would find a straight stick about 3 feet long and plant it vertically in the ground. Then they'd mark the tip of the shadow with a small stone or scratch in the dirt. After waiting exactly 15 minutes, timed by counting heartbeats or reciting familiar passages, they'd mark the shadow tip again. Drawing a line between these 2 points gave them a perfect east-west line, with the second mark always pointing east. But here's where cowboys took it further than basic survival guides teach. They'd continue this process throughout the day, creating what they called a shadow map that showed them not just direction, but their rate of travel and even the best times to rest. The genius was in the timing system cowboys developed. They discovered that shadow movement was most reliable during specific hours of the day. Early morning and late afternoon shadows moved too quickly and could be misleading, but the shadows between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. moved at a steady, predictable rate that could be used for precise navigation. Cowboys would use this shadow information to create waypoints for long journeys. They'd establish shadow bearings at key landmarks, distinctive rocks, hills, or trees, and record the exact shadow directions at specific times. This created a navigation network that could guide them back to these points, even weeks later. But the shadow stick system had another incredible feature: weather prediction. Cowboys noticed that on clear days, shadows were sharp and distinct. But when weather was changing, shadows became fuzzy or indistinct. By checking shadow quality multiple times throughout the day, they could predict storms up to 24 hours in advance. The most experienced cowboys could use shadow sticks to estimate distances with remarkable accuracy. They knew that certain shadow angles corresponded to specific times of day, and by combining this with their knowledge of travel speed, they could calculate how far they'd come and how far they had left to go. One advanced technique was called shadow bracketing, where cowboys would set up multiple shadow sticks in a line, creating a kind of solar surveying system. This allowed them to maintain a straight course across terrain where landmarks were sparse or confusing. Cowboys also used the shadow stick system for timing daily activities. They knew that when shadows reached certain lengths, it was time to water horses, rest during the heat of the day, or start looking for campsites. This natural clock was more reliable than pocket watches, which were expensive and often broken in frontier conditions. The system was so effective that some cattle drives used designated shadow riders, whose job was to maintain navigation for the entire group. These specialists could guide herds of thousands of cattle across hundreds of miles of open range without ever losing their way. Modern testing of cowboy shadow navigation techniques has shown accuracy within 1 degree of true direction, better than many compass readings in areas with magnetic interference. The system works anywhere the sun shines and requires no tools except a stick and basic arithmetic. But navigation was just one survival challenge. Cowboys also had to deal with injuries and medical emergencies hundreds of miles from any doctor. Their solution? A natural pharmacy that grew right under their horses' hooves. Number 3, the plant medicine pocket pharmacy. Cowboys carried a pharmacy in their heads, a complete knowledge of plant medicines that could treat everything from wounds to fevers to poisonous snake bites. These weren't old wives' tales or folk remedies. These were battle-tested medical treatments that kept men alive in conditions where a simple cut could mean death. The foundation of cowboy medicine was what they called trail plants, common plants that grew along most travel routes and had proven medical value. Every experienced cowboy could identify at least a dozen of these life-saving plants and knew exactly how to prepare and use them. Let's start with willow bark, the cowboy's aspirin. Cowboys discovered that the inner bark of willow trees could reduce fever, ease pain, and fight infection. But here's what made them true experts. They knew that different types of willow had different strengths, and they developed specific preparation methods that maximized the medicine's power. They'd scrape the inner bark with a knife, creating thin strips that they'd either chew directly for immediate relief or boil into a tea for stronger medicine. Cowboys learned that spring willow bark was most potent, and they'd often harvest and dry large quantities during their best collecting season. For serious wounds, cowboys relied on plantain, which they called nature's bandage. This common plant could stop bleeding, prevent infection, and speed healing. Cowboys would chew fresh plantain leaves to create a natural poultice, or dry the leaves to create a powder that could be sprinkled directly on wounds. But here's the sophisticated part. Cowboys knew to combine treatments for maximum effect. They'd use willow bark tea to clean wounds, apply plantain poultices to stop bleeding, and then wrap everything with strips of clean cloth or even spider webs, which they discovered had natural antibiotic properties. For stomach problems, a constant threat when eating unfamiliar food and drinking questionable water, cowboys used a combination of mint and sage. They'd brew strong teas that could settle stomachs, fight food poisoning, and even treat dysentery. The key was in the preparation. Cowboy mint tea was much stronger than modern herbal teas, often brewed for hours to extract maximum medicinal compounds. Snake bites were a deadly threat on the frontier, and cowboys developed a multi-stage treatment that actually worked. First, they'd immediately apply crushed echinacea root to the bite site. This plant could slow the spread of venom and boost the body's immune response. Then they'd brew strong willow bark tea to fight inflammation and pain. The most sophisticated treatment was for serious infections. Cowboys used a combination of golden seal root and honey to create a powerful antibiotic paste. They discovered that mixing these ingredients in specific ratios created a medicine that could fight infections that would otherwise be fatal. Cowboys also knew plants that could help with specific frontier challenges. For eye irritation from dust and wind, they used eyebright, a small plant that could soothe inflamed eyes and improve vision. For respiratory problems caused by smoke or dust, they used mullein leaves, often smoking them like tobacco to clear congested lungs. But the real genius of cowboy medicine was in prevention. They knew plants that could repel insects, purify water, and even boost energy during long, difficult journeys. They'd often chew certain roots or leaves that could help their bodies cope with extreme heat, cold, or exertion. One of the most valuable plants was yarrow, which cowboys called soldier's herb. This plant could stop bleeding almost instantly, fight infection, and reduce pain. Cowboys would keep dried yarrow in their saddlebags specifically for emergencies. And experienced riders could identify yarrow from horseback, even at full gallop. The preparation methods were just as important as knowing the plants. Cowboys developed techniques for drying, storing, and combining plant medicines that preserved their potency for months. They'd use animal fat to create healing salves, alcohol to make tinctures, and specific boiling methods to extract the strongest possible medicines. Modern research has confirmed that many cowboy plant medicines contain compounds that are still used in pharmaceuticals today. Willow bark contains salicin, the precursor to aspirin. Echinacea is still used to boost immune systems. Plantain contains compounds that promote wound healing and fight bacteria. But if you think plant medicine was impressive, wait until you hear about the emergency shelter technique that could keep a man alive in temperatures that would kill most people today. Incredible, right? Who knew that cowboys had developed navigation systems more reliable than early compasses? If you have any thoughts or questions about these shadow techniques, drop them in the comments below. We love hearing your insights and might even feature your comment in our next video. Number 2. The debris hut heat trap. When cowboys faced life-threatening cold without proper shelter, they had a construction technique so effective it could maintain body temperature in conditions that would be fatal otherwise. The debris hut heat trap wasn't just a pile of leaves and branches, it was an engineered survival system that used physics principles most people don't understand even today. The basic concept sounds simple. Create a small shelter and fill it with insulating materials. But cowboys developed specific construction methods that turned this simple idea into a precision survival tool. The key was understanding that smaller spaces heat faster and hold heat longer, but only if built with exact proportions. Cowboys learned that the perfect debris hut was just large enough for one person to lie down, with about 6 inches of clearance on all sides. Any larger, and it wouldn't heat efficiently. Any smaller, and you couldn't get proper insulation around your body. This precise sizing meant the difference between life and death in extreme cold. The construction started with what cowboys called the backbone, a strong ridge pole that ran from head to foot level, supported at both ends. This wasn't just any stick. Cowboys would choose a pole that was perfectly straight and strong enough to support significant weight, because the entire structure depended on this single piece. And next came the rib construction. Cowboys would lean branches against both sides of the ridgepole, creating a framework that looked like the skeleton of a fish. But here's the crucial detail. These ribs had to be placed at specific angles. Too steep and the debris would slide off. Too shallow and the structure would collapse under the weight of insulation. The real genius was in the debris selection and layering system. Cowboys didn't just pile any materials on their shelter. They used a 3-layer system that created what modern engineers would recognize as sophisticated insulation technology. The first layer, directly on the framework, was what cowboys called the mesh. Small twigs, pine needles, or grass that created tiny air pockets. This layer was crucial because it prevented larger debris from falling through while maintaining the air spaces that provided insulation. The second layer was the bulk, larger materials like leaves, bark strips, or dried grass that provided the main insulation mass. Cowboys knew that this layer needed to be at least 2 feet thick on all sides to be effective. They'd often spend hours collecting enough material because skimping on this layer meant freezing to death. The third layer was the shell, a protective covering of bark strips, pine boughs, or even stones that prevented wind from blowing away the insulation. This outer layer had to be carefully woven or weighted to stay in place during storms. But the heat trap feature was the most ingenious part. Cowboys would create a small entrance tunnel that forced them to crawl into the shelter on their bellies. This entrance design served multiple purposes. It kept cold air from flowing directly into the shelter, it trapped warm air inside, and it could be easily sealed from the inside using a pack or additional debris. Inside the shelter, cowboys used their body heat to warm the small space, but they enhanced this with heated stones when possible. They'd heat rocks by their fire, then carefully move them into the shelter using sticks or leather gloves. These stones would radiate heat for hours, turning the debris hut into a natural furnace. The most experienced cowboys could build a proper debris hut in under 2 hours, even in difficult conditions. They'd often start construction before they were desperately cold, because building a heat trap shelter required energy and manual dexterity that disappeared quickly in extreme cold. Cowboys also developed techniques for improving the shelter over multiple days. They'd add additional insulation layers, create better ventilation systems to prevent carbon dioxide buildup, and even construct separate entrance chambers that provided extra protection from wind and cold. The debris hut system was so effective that cowboys could survive nights with temperatures well below freezing while wearing only their regular trail clothes. The combination of dead airspace insulation and body heat reflection could raise the internal temperature by 30 to 40 degrees compared to outside conditions. Modern survival experts have tested cowboy debris hut construction and found that properly built shelters can maintain internal temperatures 40 degrees warmer than outside air. In some cases, cowboys staying in these shelters survived conditions that would be fatal, even with modern sleeping bags and tents. But even the best shelter was useless if you couldn't find food. Cowboys had to be able to locate calories in environments where most people would starve. Their solution was a hunting and gathering system so effective it could provide complete nutrition using nothing but natural resources. Number 1, the natural food location system. Here's the ultimate cowboy survival secret: they never went hungry, no matter how barren the landscape looked. Cowboys developed a food location system so comprehensive it could provide meat, vegetables, and even dessert using nothing but knowledge of animal behavior and plant identification. This wasn't just about shooting game, it was about understanding the invisible food web that existed everywhere they traveled. The foundation of cowboy food location was reading sign, the subtle indicators that revealed where animals lived, fed, and traveled. But cowboys took this knowledge far beyond simple tracking. They learned to read the landscape like a menu, identifying not just where animals were, but which animals would be easiest to catch and provide the most nutrition. Cowboys discovered that water sources were food magnets. Every spring, stream, or water hole was surrounded by a complex ecosystem of edible plants and huntable animals. But the genius was in timing. Cowboys learned the daily schedules of different animals, knowing exactly when various species would come to water. Early morning, just after dawn, was rabbit and bird time. Small game came to water when predators were less active, making them easier targets for cowboys with snares or simple weapons. Midday brought different opportunities: lizards, snakes, and ground-dwelling creatures that could be caught by hand with the right techniques. Evening was big game time. Deer, elk, and other large animals preferred to drink at dusk, using cover of changing light to avoid predators. Cowboys positioned themselves downwind from water sources during these prime hunting hours, often taking large game with single, well-placed shots. But cowboys didn't rely only on hunting. They developed sophisticated plant identification skills that could locate edible roots, berries, nuts, and greens in nearly any environment. The key was understanding plant communities, groups of plants that grew together and indicated the presence of specific food sources. For example, cowboys knew that areas with wild onions usually also contained other edible roots like wild carrots or cattail tubers. They learned that berry patches were often surrounded by edible greens, and that nut trees indicated soil conditions that supported other food plants. The most valuable skill was identifying calorie plants, plants that provided significant nutrition rather than just vitamins or minerals. Cowboys could locate wild potatoes, protein-rich nuts, and energy-dense roots that could sustain a man for days. They knew which plants could be eaten raw and which required specific preparation to be safe and nutritious. Cowboys also mastered preservation techniques that could turn temporary abundance into long-term food security. They knew how to dry meat into jerky that would last for months, how to process nuts and seeds into portable, high-energy foods, and how to preserve plant foods using natural methods. One sophisticated technique was cache hunting. Cowboys would locate animal food caches and borrow from them. Squirrels, chipmunks, and other animals often stored nuts, seeds, and dried foods in hidden locations. Experienced cowboys could identify these caches and take a portion without harming the animal's survival. Cowboys developed specific hunting tools that could be made from natural materials. They could craft effective snares from plant fibers, create fish traps from woven branches, and even make hunting weapons like rabbit sticks or bird slings, using only materials found in nature. The fishing knowledge was particularly sophisticated. Cowboys learned to read water conditions, identify fish feeding areas, and create effective fishing gear from improvised materials. They could make hooks from thorns or bones, lines from plant fibers or animal sinew, and bait from insects or worms they located using specific environmental indicators. But the real mastery was in seasonal awareness. Cowboys understood that different foods were available at different times of year, and they planned their routes and timing to take advantage of natural abundance. They knew when berries ripened, when nuts fell, when certain animals were fattest and easiest to hunt. Cowboys also learned to process foods that were normally inedible. They knew techniques for removing toxins from plants, making bitter foods palatable, and extracting nutrition from materials that most people would consider waste. Acorns, for example, could be processed into nutritious flour using specific leaching techniques. The most experienced cowboys could look at any landscape and immediately identify multiple food sources. They could estimate how many days they could survive in an area, what tools they'd need to access different foods, and how to maintain a balanced diet using only wild resources. Modern nutritionists have analyzed cowboy wilderness diets and found them remarkably complete. By combining wild game, plant foods, and preserved items, cowboys could maintain excellent health for months at a time, using only natural food sources. Thanks for joining us on this journey through the Wild West's most ingenious survival secrets. If you enjoyed discovering these lost frontier techniques, give us a thumbs up and share it with fellow survival enthusiasts and history buffs. And remember, there's a lot more forgotten wisdom to discover. So hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss our next deep dive into the untold survival stories of the frontier.